Hello, I'm Bradley Alisea, and today I'm going to talk about Community Resource Management 1. This will be the first video in a two-part series, and I'm going to talk in this video about specific resources that you can manage in your community, and then the second video will be a deep dive into some of those issues in greater detail. So let me share my screen and show you our list of resources. So the first I'd like to talk about today is personas. And personas are it's a technique used to simulate different types of individuals. Sometimes they might be called good stereotypes, simulating different types of community members and understanding how they might behave in a given situation. So this is like the mean behavior of some defined group of people. So these personas, for example, could be different contributor types. So for example, people who engage with code quite heavily, or discussion leaders, or technical writers, or they could be different user types. And so separate from their involvement in the community, they might be power users, people who use the software a lot, casual users, and maybe users with disabilities. And these personas are sort of archetypes that we can use to maybe help engage certain groups of people, or alternatively, figure out maybe what the needs of certain groups of people are in the software. So for example, with users with disabilities, you might recruit those people to maybe test or give feedback on some accessibility features in the software. You might want to treat people who engage with code very deeply, give them different sets of incentives, give them different sets of information than people who are technical writers, because this is something they need to fulfill the role in the community. So personas are valuable in a number of ways. They provide a window into the different needs and expectations of these populations. And the Mozilla open source community has done a lot of work on developing personas and pathways and methodology. So if we go to their document that they have, we'll see that they have this personas and pathways exercise that they do. So this is a persona that someone has designed. This is something very heavily involving design techniques. So this is something that they often use to describe an imaginary user. It's not just blindly generated, it's based on observations and understandings of actual potential or current users. And it's detailed enough so that it feels real to the designer, so that they can imagine the persona's needs and responses to a product or project. And so the idea here is to simulate these type of person well enough to cater to their needs or to design for them in some way. So this is something that they've used to sort of figure out what these groups look like, what they respond to in terms of incentives, et cetera. But there's also this issue of pathways. And pathways, of course, are important for understanding how different people go through the community in different ways. So if we think about the pathway through our community as a pathway from discovery to leadership, and there are different steps along the way. This is the ideal path, but we want to know, for example, if, say, someone who's very focused on coding or very focused on documentation or very focused maybe on usability, how they go through the community, how they encounter each step, and more importantly, if there's a bottleneck that's stopping them from progressing. So we have a number of different steps in this pathway. We have discovery, where you first hear about a group or project. You have first contact. This is where you first engage with the project or group. Participation is how they first participate or communicate or come to contribute to the group. So, you have to have a first step there, first issue. Then sustained participation, which is how their contribution or involvement can continue. So when you make that first contribution, then you want to make subsequent contributions. And the question is, can you do that effectively? Then there's network participation. So this is where you're finding collaborators within the community or bringing them from outside the community. And then finally, leadership, which is, how then when you start doing the serial contribution, when you get into this pattern, then you might take ownership of a project and then you exhibit leadership. So if you're working with a good persona, you can figure out how these personas move through these steps, you can find bottlenecks and potentially help people like the persona overcome the bottleneck. So it may be that, for example, your community has an issue with bringing people into a community Slack and getting them into the Slack channels, but they have problems getting to the step of contribution. And that's something you often see. You have a lot of flow through into the community, into the Slack, and then people don't do anything. They don't contribute, they don't discuss anything, they don't contribute. And there are a number of reasons for that. But finding those personas, finding those different groups, and figuring out what they want to see is important. And it can help overcome something like that. So then they have an assignment that they do with their people and this is usually the Open Leaders program. I know I was in the Open Leaders program when we did this sort of exercise. There's this other article on 10 open source personas. This is where they have personas defined for you, this article, and then finding users. This is from Open Source Guide. This is actually something that gives you some insight into finding users for your project. So there are things you want to do, like spread the word, figure out your message, help people find and follow your project. These are all things that you would do for any persona. But you might do it a little bit differently for different personas. Go to where your project audience is, and this could be online or, as we'll mention later, offline. And then go where your project audience is offline. And these are different strategies, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on as to how to approach that. And then build a reputation, and then keep at it, be persistent. And so these are things that are all important things for your open source community, and definitely personas can help target some of those for different audiences. So another aspect of personas is the need to promote your work or project to different audiences, but this is in terms of offline and online. So this is not just in terms of like for different maybe audiences of interest, but places where they are. And so this is getting the message out to different groups of people. It's not that offline and online audiences are mutually exclusive. They're usually not. But there are different versions of your community that you want to present, and there are different reasons. And we'll talk about a specific example of that, why that is in a minute. This will allow you to build different perspectives on your work, depending on the needs of interests of different audiences. So it's not just the personas, it's where you sort of advertise your project. So for example, the online promotion of open source projects can be done in 3 basic ways. And I give these examples as sort of, again, archetypes of resources, but you can also think of them as, you don't have to have exactly this set of things, but these are the core things that usually are needed to get the word out. So you need a website, you need a social media channel or more than one social media channel, and virtual talks. So every project should have a good up-to-date website. It's just a fact of life. It's a good static location that you can put resources and bring people into a centralized location. You can build your website with, say, something like GitHub Pages, or you can use some other resource. The website should be a front door linking all the pieces of your project together. So that's an important step. And then your social media presence should also be there, and you should be able to advertise things going on in your community. So this is more of a dynamic advertisement medium. And you would have, something like you might advertise events, you might advertise, different milestones in the community. People might, complete, a pull request or something like that, some other task, and you might advertise that and tag them in it. Or you might just advertise what's going on. Like there are these things called GitHub repository cards, and they're basically little graphics that show the name of the repository and then the status in terms of its followers, its forks, its stars, its likes, whatever. So there are a lot of different active issues, number of contributors. There are a lot of different attributes on this card. And one thing you can do is advertise a repository by using a repository card and say this repository is open for contributions. And maybe includes maybe a link to an issue or something. This is a way to advertise different repositories advertise, perhaps sometimes you can advertise what languages you use in your community. These are ways to get the word out about what's going on in the community. You know, what kind of people you're looking for, that it's active, that it's something that people want to be a part of. Now, it's important to remember on social media that you want to use each sort of type of social media differently. So for example, if you use Twitter and you use Reddit, so you use both of those channels, they're going to have different audiences and they're going to have different ways of doing things. So Reddit is not the same as Twitter. Facebook is not the same as Reddit. It's not the same as Twitter, and so forth. So, you know, you want to make sure you understand how the medium kind of works before you start putting things out. Reddit is more of sort of a forum, and Twitter is more of kind of like rapid fire, you know, posts. So, and there's a timeline, you know, it's a different thing. So you need to have a little bit different strategy for each. But that being said, you know, you should leverage this as much as you can and figure out how you want to advertise your project and where it's most effective. So that's online promotion, and I think that's all very good and very necessary. But sometimes you want to advertise offline, and the reason for this is because you have different types of people offline. Now, this is a picture of a meeting at the Royal Society of London. So this is a scientific society. It's very old, it's several hundred years old. And this is a picture of Stephen Larson, who's one of the senior contributors at OpenWorm. He's been around since the beginning of OpenWorm. And he's talking right now about this OpenWorm project. And several years ago at the Royal Society, there was a series of talks. They have these sort of seminars or lectures, set of lecture series that they have on different topics. And OpenWorm was one of the topics. And so all these people in the audience are here to learn about OpenWorm. Now, some of them may have already heard about this online, but there's some credibility in taking it offline and going into a room with people, these people here. And these people are maybe lab leaders. They're, you know, people established in the C. elegans community, and OpenWorm is a platform for C. elegans modeling, and it's open source. So they're really wanting to learn about this project and how it could be useful to them in their work. So then you have this talk where you present it at the level of like someone who's leading a biological lab, and they might want to use a computational method for improving upon their work. They might be interested in the open aspect of it. They might be interested in the C. elegans aspect of it. So making this talk interesting to these people is important, but also, you know, having an offline component is important because it gets different. It's kind of a different group of people, but also people give it a little bit more credibility because you're kind of, you know, broadening your scope. And so examples of offline promotion include things like TED Talks, local meetups, academic conferences and symposia, lecture series, and more. So there are a broad set of opportunities. You can do this anywhere. You don't need to go to the Royal Society of London to do this. But it's imperative that you get out and give talks about your project, or else people won't know about it. And so this broadens your audience for your project beyond skill types and stakeholders who are typically online. We'll talk about stakeholders later on. Then there's this issue of financial support. So you've advertised your project, you've imagined your personas, so you know kind of who's there, but you want to support your project financially. And that can be very challenging depending on the size and the scope of your project. So there are a number of ways to derive financial support for open source software development and community building. One approach is to utilize a financial sponsorship organization. And one of the example of which is NumFocus, which works with different open source projects that in the scientific computing realm, and they take these, you know, basically small little concerns, and they sponsor them for financial grants, for fundraising and things like that. NumFocus also offers other organizations small scale grants on the order of $5,000 to $8,000 per grant cycle for a future development of something. So, you know, usually it's something like a new feature, maybe like a refactoring. It might be developing some documentation You might hire someone to do this, or you might need some equipment. You can write it into the grant, get a small grant to do this. Now, this is not necessarily sustainable, but it does give you some opportunities to fund work that needs to be done that you can't necessarily find a contributor to do for, on a volunteer basis. Another approach is to attain 501c3 status for yourself. So you might have your own nonprofit foundation status for your organization. This is good for software and community activities for which a profit is not derived nor expected. But it's also challenging because you need to find a board of directors and you need to have a formal organizational structure. So if it's a very small concern, it may not be good for you. This is something the Open Run Foundation has done for fundraising and financial grant purposes. It requires a formal board of directors. They have to meet once a year. But furthermore, you need to have, a formal structure, meetings and things like that to make sure that your organization is intact. And so, that's another way you can raise money, is to have that designation and then raise funds through that and not have to incur any sort of tax liability. Now, there are a number of other funding sources that may be available. So, you might go for like a traditional grant from a granting agency or a foundation. You might become a nonprofit foundation. You might join a financial sponsorship organization. You might have some sort of endowment that you use. But this is all, these are all just kind of choices you have to make depending on your size but the important thing to remember is finding the funding stream is usually important for sustainability. So it's something that really makes open source sustainability hard. No one's really solved this problem. So this is something that is an open problem. It's hard to kind of find the right mix of things. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mozilla and Linux foundations. So the Mozilla Foundation was sort of a spin-off of Netscape. And they founded this as a way to sort of, when they open source Netscape, they founded the Mozilla Foundation. And since, it was largely involved in developing the Mozilla browser, but since then they've been doing a lot of open science and open source type of advocacy work and other types of good practice work. So they don't really derive a lot of money from that. They derive a lot of money from their browser interests. But it's just one example of how they might cross-fund some of these activities. The Linux Foundation is a little bit different. They do, and I'll show you how they make their money. They do this through different services that they offer. And so these are large and mature open source organizations. So if you look to those examples, you'll see how they figured out how to fund their activities. So they have large budgets compared to most open source organizations. It's important to keep in mind that the size is really going to depend on what you can do in your history of where you come from as well. I mean, Mozilla comes from, a very successful product, so it's kind of hard to replicate. So this is a link to NumFocus. This is their website. This is a Wikipedia stub on 501c3 organizations. It gives you a little bit of information about those. Mozilla's status is a 501c3, so this tells you a little bit about that. And then Linux Foundation revenues, which are available as a open source document here on ProPublica. If you go in here, you'll find out that the Linux Foundation in 2019 had $124 million in revenue, and 99.7 of that was from something called program services. So the program services are, of course, things like where you take some part of the open source platform, and you make it something that you can sell, or, a service that you can provide to another set of organizations. And people pay for this because, it's something that's useful to them. Typically, open source licenses don't stress like financial gain, but these are things that can be worked around. There are ways that you can raise money in that way. You can basically take the things that you built in an open source platform, package it in a certain way, and sell that to some other interests. So there are ways you can make money even with open source software. But this is something that, of course, again, you have to be a big organization for people to want to buy something from you, service or otherwise. And then, it depends on whether you have something that is something people want to pay for. If it's something that's quite valuable, then that's, the people will pay for it. Otherwise, I'll just use the open source version. It's kind of a sticky issue. But this is, and so, the Linux Foundation actually is a 501c6. So it's a little bit different corporate structure. And what I've done here is I've included some other business types. So a LegalZoom document that shows the other types of business structures that you can adopt if you're interested. Depends on what you really want to do and what you have in terms of resources to work with. Okay, now this is one of the things about like financing open source is that you have money coming in and money going out. And so if you don't have a lot of money coming in, you want to have like a way to facilitate things without spending a lot of money. So how do we do that? Well, there are ways to do this. So there are ways to get sort of things funded in pieces. For example, there are open source internship programs that an open source organization can participate in to defray the costs of certain things in the community, like maintenance or educational activities. So Google runs two programs. They run the Google Summer of Code and they run the Google Season of Docs. And the Google Summer of Code allows an open source organization to sponsor a student, and Google will pay that student a stipend. And that student then will do something in the community. They'll maybe maintain a repository, they'll maintain some code of some type, or they will maybe build a new project. So they can do all these things that, you give them you make them write a proposal. They, are highly skilled, highly motivated students. They get paid for it, and then they get to put it on their resume. And they may even join your community and participate in your community later. So you're building up expertise locally. So you're actually able to teach students about open source. You have them solve a technical barrier to what the organization can't solve on its own. It needs to overcome, and so you get someone who's getting paid to do it, so they're motivated properly, and then it creates a potential maintainer in the future. Or sometimes it enforces virtuous habits. Sometimes you can have summer code programs year after year, and you get people coming in who are attracted by the program. They may not get selected for the program, but they contribute something to the community, or they join the community in some other capacity. So this, these types of projects, Season of Docs, a Summer of Code, they're months-long projects. They give you a means to doing these things and the financing to do it as well. I don't really know if there are too many other projects or programs like this, but it's really something that's a need, I think, in the open source communities to have these kind of financial sponsorship arrangements that really kind of bootstrap a lot of what's going on in the community. Now, separate to that, there are ways to get educational resources into the community. So your community will often need to have educational resources at their disposal. You'll need to teach contributors about different new things, whether it be programming languages or whether it be like higher order concepts. And so here I've assembled some educational resources that have been developed in an open source manner. Some of these are curated resources, some of these are sort of tutorials, but they all really kind of serve open source communities. They're all open source. They all have their own sort of open access aspects, so people can use them freely. They're free to the organization, but if you put them together in the right way, you can really kind of maximize their impact. And so you can start with very vocational skills like coding courses. So Free Code Camp is an example of an open source coding course where it teaches certain technical skills like certain languages, certain procedures, and then it offers certifications for it. And this is all open source and free. And there are ways that you can get your contributors steered towards these type of courses where they can pick up skills that they need. Then there's something called Wakelet, which is a series of open source educational tools for coding and technology. And again, this is like Free Code Camp. It's a little bit broader, but it's still in that vocational category. Then maybe you need to teach your contributors not like vocational skills, but like conceptual skills and higher order skills. So like maybe you want to teach them about deep learning, or maybe you want to teach them about computational neuroscience, right? These are very big academic topics. Well, fortunately, people have been working on developing tools to teach people these online and open source, so they're free to actually engage with, and they can be done at their own speed. So people don't have to do it in a formal course. They can do something called an extended pod or a slow pod, and they can learn things at their own pace over the course of months instead of a couple weeks, or learn parts where they need to catch up. And so Neuromatch Academy, which is an organization that was founded in 2020, has done this very successfully in the areas of computational neuroscience and deep learning. And so they run a summer school. It's online. It's about 2 weeks long or 3 weeks long. And it has, it's like this fire hose method of instruction where you just get all of these different topics delivered to you in rapid source. So in rapid sequence. So you get all these topics delivered to you in rapid sequence, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can experience it that way, or you can experience it more slowly and drawn out. And so this helps people to learn these concepts in different ways based on their persona, based on how much they need to learn. There are other organizations like the Active Inference Lab and the Santa Fe Institute that offer similar types of resources for other topics, like complexity theory and active inference and predictive processing, and even network science, their resources, which brings us to this organization here, the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. And I'm involved in that. And one thing we've developed based on some of these resources is something called the Brains, Behavior, and Complexity. And this is something we've developed to tie a lot of these resources together so that when we have people coming into our projects, we can teach them the things that they need to learn. They need to catch up on different topics in neuroscience or different topics in AI and neural networks. They can learn all these things and have a sort of a baseline of understanding. A lot of times we get non-traditional students or people who are sort of post-bac students, and they need to equalize their expertise in different ways. And so we can build, this is one of these examples where you're curating these resources for people to use. So this is a nice way to sort of equalize skill in the community, to bring these different personas up to speed in different ways. And then let's return to stakeholders, because I just mentioned stakeholders briefly in the offline versus online promotion of your project, but really stakeholders exist everywhere. And so you're going to have different sources for your stakeholders. They're going to be oftentimes very diverse. Stakeholders are defined as projects. Projects have a various set of stakeholders who are impacted by or have an interest in the project. So I'll use the Rockwire Initiative as an example. As a campus mobile app, it's actually producer of campus mobile apps, I guess. The Rockwire Initiative has various stakeholders from across a campus that they serve. And it touches, the apps that they develop touch people's daily lives in different ways. So you have people, say, in the business school or in the athletics department or in the humanities, and they all use this app that's developed on the platform in different ways. And so, these are all potential stakeholders. The app is, managing personal data, it's managing different types of information, and people want to have a sort of a say in some of the policies surrounding this, or some of the open source aspects that are developed. So, these stakeholders can be very diverse, and they should be very diverse to serve a lot of the constituencies that you're serving. In the example of the Open Worm Foundation, you have practicing scientists who are interested, but you also have people like students or people who might just be interested in the, whatever is being produced. There are a lot of people who just think it's very cool. And so they're stakeholders because you can use the Open Worm, things that the Open Worm Foundation is producing for art or in the area of robotics. There are a lot of areas that this open source set of tools touches, and these people should have a seat at the table in terms of determining the course forward. And so it's a good practice to understand the identities of your potential stakeholders. So you might use a personas exercise for that, to figure out who your stakeholders are. or you might build a formal committee to sort of oversee what's going on with your project's roadmap. So there are different ways you can approach, sort of placating your stakeholders. And I mean that in a very virtuous way. I don't mean that to be derogatory, but stakeholders, the more you can engage with stakeholders, the more goodwill you can build up. Now, the Linux Foundation has a document on setting an open source strategy, so that you might want to check that out to understand how to build an open source strategy for these different resources. There are a couple of academic papers as well. So this one is exploring the role of commercial stakeholders in open source software evolution. And this just talks about how you have, in some cases, you have large corporations that use your software. Sometimes, the open source software involves a commercial company. And so sometimes it's managed by commercial software corporations and sometimes it's not. And so this is an example of the Eclipse project, which is part of IBM's project management. And so this is a report on how this is managed versus maybe something smaller, like, where you have you and a couple of your friends, or something like the OpenWorm Foundation, where it's people who have training in C. elegans biology and computational biology, and then inform this software. So, I mean, there are different ways, it could be managed by a large corporation, or it could be managed by, a group of experts, or it could be managed by just some people fooling around. I mean, there are different ways you can develop these projects. And so with the involvement of commercial companies, it is found that OSS projects achieve sustained productivity, increasing the amount of output produced and intake of new developers. So not surprisingly, if you're a large corporation, you can devote more to open source development. And so this is, this maybe ensures success sometimes, which is, maybe not such good news for smaller open source concerns, but it does talk about why commercial companies maybe see more success in some of their efforts. The second paper I wanted to talk about is the economic motivation of open source software, stakeholder perspectives. And this talks more about the economic motivations, about how open source software has enabled large system integrators to increase their profits through cost savings to reach more customers due to flexible pricing. So this is upset existing ecosystems and shuffled structural relationships, resulting in the emergence of firms providing consulting services to open source projects. So this just talks about a new area that, of interactions between open source projects and corporations and how that works. And so these are all things, where you have different stakeholders in different open source organizations. So I'll leave that to you to read. And so the next part I wanted, and I think this is the last section here. This is where we want to think maybe ahead in terms of how to plan out our open source community activities and perhaps integrating them within the plans of the organization. And so one of the things I've come up with is this idea of a master plan or global model. And so this master plan is a sort of a graphical model that you may use to estimate all the possible conduits into your community. And so these conduits involve different issues. So these issues such as incentives, sustainability, catalyzation, communication and innovation, and embedding. So incentives refer to ways in which we can encourage people to contribute. Sustainability refers to keeping contributions relevant across releases, in addition to perpetuating the activities of new and continuing contributors. Catalyzation refers to keeping the community relevant and open to new initiatives. Communication and innovation refers to the facilitation of open discussion and the encouragement of novel ideas. Embedding involves bootstrapping, calls for involvement in the program itself, or more in the GitHub repository. And so all these are different ways in which people will sort of join the community. Each one of these points is a conduit, and the conduits can be realized in different ways. So I published a blog post on this a while back, and this shows the graphical model. So we have embedding, incentives, communication, innovation, sustainability, and catalyzation. Now, So embedding is this idea that you have sort of people embedded in the process, in the development process. So you have calls for involvement, you have different forks, you have different paid contributors, you try to attract contributors, you use public lectures to try to attract people, you use curricular engagement or engagement through courses or other things. You have topical initiatives, so you might focus on a certain topic. You might have external media that you utilize. This is all just embedding the community of people, of contributors into the development process. The incentives, on the other hand, are both financial, sometimes they're educational, and sometimes they have, they're recognition based. So you have an open source contributor who might engage in an formal university curriculum. They might engage in a course where the software is used, or you work with the course at a local university to work with your software and maybe have a pipeline of contributors. You might have educational prerequisites that you need to fulfill, that you need to make sure people are on the same page about, and that's a way to hook them into the ecosystem. You have defined contributions that people make. So when people make defined contributions, that's an incentive to be recognized, to make more contributions. You recognize them through some sort of badge system or recognition based system, or you maybe mention them in a newsletter or something. And you have paid contributors who get paid for their contributions. So these are interns or other types of people. And then you have credentials like micro badges, which can be used to reward, very small activities in the community or contributions. And those are all just kind of recognition-based incentives. Communication and innovation. So communication doesn't happen without innovation and vice versa. So you want to communicate things to people. In doing so, you drive innovation. So, you have all sorts of things. You have wikis and tutorials and newsletters, keeping people current, giving them information about how the platform operates. You have contributions in forms of discussions and publications and all these things that really kind of drive innovation. And so, there are bug reports and other things that you can use to drive innovation, but you have to use communication to get there. And of course, innovation drives more communication because people want to know how you innovated and how they can contribute, how that can be incorporated into the platform and so forth. Catalyzation is a way to sort of, get people interested and get people contributing. So it's kind of like embedding, except that you have this catalyzation, you're actively trying to drive contributors and contributions. So there are a number of paths to contribution. There are a number of ways you can contribute. And then we try to foster activities within that sphere. Sustainability is where you are trying to maintain your software or improve upon it in some way and keeping it current. So we have a lot of different contributions and evaluations of such, and you have contribution templates which drive and maintain record of what's been done and what's been kept. You have sets of issues that are created over time, recycled. You just try to keep current. Now, the interesting thing about embedding is you can embed these calls for involvement right into the application itself. So that's a key part of embedding, is that I want to be able to announce my community to my user base directly. So you might, for example, put it on a splash screen as a link or as some sort of attribution. You might also want to have open source community activities embedded in the software itself. So you might have ways to interact with the open source community through the application, or you might have your open source community have a component of it in the GitHub organization where your code resides. So people are right there and they can interact with it. So then as an alternative to this master plan, and this master plan is good for planning out next steps and planning out what's going on, different ways you can engage people and that. But another way to do this is through a maturity model. So a maturity model is to take all of this and understand the sort of relative level of maturity of each of these components. So for example, there are software maturity models, and this has an open source maturity model, Wikipedia stuff that talks about how this works in software development. But this actually can work in evaluating this master plan. So for example, we look at catalyzation, embedding, sustainability. So we all evaluate these three things, and we find that catalyzation, actually, we're pretty mature in terms of catalyzation. We're able to keep things relevant, and we don't really need too much more development in that area. By contrast, though, sustainability and embedding are very immature. Embedding being the most immature of all. And so what that means is that we should focus more attention on embedding and maybe some attention on sustainability, and we don't have to necessarily invest more attention into catalyzation or incentives or communication and innovation, because we already have those at a mature state. And so this will help us understand where we need to develop, where we need to provide resources and the like. So that's all I have for this this talk. So the next step is to watch the community resources video number 2, and I'll see you there. Thank you.